I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Lara Aknin from psychology, who will be talking about something important to us all, that is the science of happiness, and she will be bringing Canadian perspectives. She has been a winner of the Cormack Teaching Award in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences in 2016. Her research interests lie at the intersection of social psychology, positive psychology, economics, judgment, and decision-making. The questions she pursues often include the study of what makes people happy, the emotional consequences of kind or generous behavior, and the well-being outcomes of specific spending choices we choose collectively amongst us as citizens and governments. Her publications are myriad. I won't outline them to you. But what intrigues me, and what indeed brought forward her nomination to this series, is her cross-national focus and search for cross-cultural evidence for a psychological universal in a co-authored article, for example, in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. Nicole is a third-year psychology student and mentor in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, and she has agreed very kindly to start off the questions and indeed help moderate some of the questions you may have. Dr. Aknin, please.
All right, well, thanks for having me. My name is Lara Aknin, and I'm a faculty member in the psychology department here at SFU. And today I'd like to talk with you about science's secrets to greater happiness. Now, by way of an introduction, I'd like to collect some data from all of you, not data that I'll be using for any publication, but by way of an introduction to get you warmed up on the topic. So I'd like to ask all of you to take a second and rate your general happiness on this 10-point happiness scale, from 1, not at all, to 10, extremely happy. Give you a second to commit to an answer. Once you've got that in mind, I'm going to invite you to close your eyes and daydream for just a second. I'd like you to close your eyes, sit back and relax, and think about what your ideal life might be like in 5 to 10 years from now. Where might you be living? What might you be doing? What might your family makeup look like? How will you spend your weekends? With that ideal life in mind, I'd like you to open your eyes and imagine where you might rate yourself on this 10-point happiness scale if that ideal life came true. Again, please just try to commit to a number. Now, I won't out anybody and ask for their actual happiness reports, but I'm going to guess that most people in this room rated themselves on this 10-point happiness scale using the upper half, somewhere in the realm of 6 to 10. If I had to be more specific, I would probably guess in the ballpark of 7 to 9, or maybe 7 to 8 right now as we approach midterm season. And if that's true, I think that aligns quite nicely with some national data collected by Gallup, suggesting that Canada, on average, ranks around 7th in the world, with an average happiness score of around 7.3. Now, I'm going to ask everyone to do a little simple mental arithmetic and subtract, or first think about how happy you were with your ideal life, that happiness score you provided, and subtract your current happiness score. Just by a show of hands, I'm going to ask how many people are left with a positive score, indicating that you think you might be happier if that ideal life came true than you currently are right now. Just a show of hands. Right, so many of us, and I think that's really interesting and informative because it suggests many of us have intuitions about what it is that makes us happy. And in today's short talk, I'd like to point out what science suggests to this regard. That is, what science suggests might make us happy, or at least a few points. Now, no talk on the predictors of happiness would be complete, and so I will just start off with this point that strong and satisfactory social relationships are in fact one of, if not the top predictor of life satisfaction and general overall well-being. Now, this finding emerges in a diverse array of research streams, so not just psychology, but economics, sociology, and in fact, almost any discipline that tries to investigate what makes people happy often finds that social relationships is one, if not the top predictor of our happiness reports. Now, because of the robust evidence to this effect, I don't have time to tell you about the dozens or hundreds of studies documenting this claim, but I'll tell you about just one of them that is one of my favorites, at least examining this relationship. So some of the evidence emerges from a study collected or conducted by Diener and Martin EP Seligman when they wanted to understand what makes people happy, and particularly what makes the happiest folks particularly happy. So what they did was collect data from several hundred students, ask people to fill out a large series of happiness questionnaires, and that allowed them to identify how happy people were and zero in on the top 10%. They looked quite closely at this top 10% and did some extra investigation, asking their friends and family members to report how happy they were, asking these people to talk about their lives so that they could really dig deeply and understand what makes these folks so happy. What they found was that everybody in the top 10% reported having strong and satisfactory social relationships in their life. Now, this wasn't to say that others didn't as well. The bottom 90% of the distribution, some of them also reported that they had strong and satisfactory social relationships. And so the authors recommend or stated that social relationships seem to be necessary, but not sufficient for achieving our highest levels of happiness. So it seems that social relationships are indeed key, but what other predictors help us experience our greatest happiness? Well, a lot of evidence suggests that engaging in exercise or physical activity is a strong correlate and predictor of happiness. So engaging in exercise is obviously something that boosts our mood in the short term and also in the long term as well. But some new evidence that was actually published within the past 2 weeks suggests that this relationship might be even more far-reaching than we first understood. That is, people who move about in their average daily lives outside of exercise also appear to report higher levels of happiness. So this can be taking your pet out for a walk, going for an evening stroll, engaging in more physical activity, simply walking to the bus stop might be associated with these higher levels of happiness. In addition to engaging in exercise, a growing body of research suggests that helping other people is one way to foster and experience higher levels of happiness. So for instance, engaging in blood donations, donating our time to help other people, all these types of activities, or many of them, have been shown to be associated or lead to higher levels of happiness. And in fact, some of the best evidence collected to date suggests that this relationship is bidirectional. So helping other people can make us happier, but happier people are more likely to engage in this type of generous behavior. So it seems to be this positive feedback loop. Along similar lines, while engaging in kind behavior leads us to feel happy, so too does being grateful for the help we receive from other people. Now, this might remind you of an idea that was popularized, as far as I know, in my household by Oprah Winfrey, who used to champion the emotional benefits of keeping a gratitude journal or simply counting your blessings. Well, this idea was actually empirically tested by a team of researchers from UC Davis, led by Bob Emmons. And what he did, he and his colleagues recruited a large sample of students and asked them to keep a journal for a period of 2 to 3 weeks. Now, participants were randomly assigned to one of 3 conditions. The first condition was asked to keep a gratitude journal, to jot down the things in their life that they were grateful for. So every night they were asked to return to this prompt and read it and respond. So there are many things in our lives, both large and small, that we might be grateful about. Think back over today, and on the lines below, write up to 5 things in your life that you might be grateful for. Now, I think it's important to note that people didn't have to reach very far and wide or think of extravagant experiences to complete these daily responses. In fact, people wrote down what we might consider pretty mundane things, just drawing attention to their everyday blessings. For instance, students responded that they were grateful for their wonderful parents, for waking up in the morning, or for their favorite band, the Rolling Stones. Now, while this gratitude journal might be something we all aspire to, I think it's not something we always do on a regular basis. In fact, if I'm perfectly honest, one thing I tend to do is not go home and write down or talk about all the things I'm grateful for. I actually default to the complete opposite. And by that I mean I might go home and complain about the hassles of my daily life. And I think it's actually interesting that these researchers included a control condition, one control condition, that reflects this possibility. So another group of participants were asked to keep a hassles journal, if you will. They were asked to read this and reply for 2 to 3 weeks. Hassles are irritants, things that annoy or bother you. They occur in various domains of life, including relationships, work, school, housing, finances, health, and so forth. Think back over today, and on the lines below, list up to 5 hassles in your life. So this kind of covers my alternative, but you might be thinking this isn't a perfect control. And so the authors included a third condition where people were asked to journal daily, but not necessarily with a positive or negative spin on what they were writing, just simply to recap their recent life events. So how did these different behaviors influence people's well-being over this series of 2 to 3 weeks? Were people who kept the gratitude journal any happier? Yes, indeed they were. So people who kept the gratitude journal were significantly happier at the end of the study than participants in the other 2 conditions. And moreover, they actually reported getting more and better sleep, which is kind of an interesting additional wrinkle in the findings. So It seems that letting our minds wander to revisit the past or revisit things that other people have done for us might make us happy, but what about engaging in mind wandering more generally? Well, some new research suggests that although humans might default to mind wandering quite frequently, we're actually happier when our minds stay put. In fact, some recent evidence from Matt Killingsworth and Dan Gilbert used a really interesting design where contacting people through a new iPhone app, they buzzed people at regular intervals to ask them how happy they were feeling, what they were doing, and if they were thinking about what they were doing or something else. What they found was, I think, two pretty interesting findings. The first is that people quite regularly engage in mind-wandering behavior. In fact, they do it quite frequently when they're engaging in almost any type behavior save for one, which is lovemaking. Other than that, our minds are quite prone to leaving the present. Beyond that, they found that when people engage in mind wandering, they're actually less happy than they are when living in the moment. And so I think what this suggests is that if you feel your mind starting to disengage from what you're doing, you might be happier if you try to stay put. All right, so what about money? Money is often something that influences people's imagined or ideal life in 5 to 10 years from now, but what does the evidence suggest in terms of having more money and being happy? Well, the evidence suggests that having more money is associated with higher levels of happiness, but this relationship isn't as strong as most people suspect. Indeed, while people living in wealthier nations like us in Canada are typically on average happier than people living in less wealthy nations, moving from the middle of the income distribution to the very top within a wealthy nation actually has a surprisingly small impact on your happiness. And so over the past decade or so, researchers have been trying to examine what we can do with our money that might actually allow us to buy some more happiness. The logic here is that if having more money if your bank account doesn't bring a whole lot more happiness, how can we use this money to go about pursuing effective strategies for increasing our happiness? And along these lines, there have been several generative lines of research, but the one I'm going to focus on for the next few minutes is some of my own, investigating whether spending money on others leads to higher levels of happiness than spending money on ourselves. So this research started when I was in graduate school at UBC, and so was conducted with Elizabeth Dunn and, at UBC and Mike Norton from Harvard Business School. And we wanted to take a first look at whether spending money on others might be associated with higher levels of happiness. And so what we did was ask a large and nationally representative sample of over 600 Americans how they spend their money in an average month. Specifically, we asked how much money they spent on 4 spending categories. So the first was bills and expenses, the second was gifts for themselves, the third was gifts for others, and the fourth was donations to charity. Now, to get an idea of how much money people spend on average on themselves and others, we classified these 4 spending categories into 2 spending indices. So the first was we created an index of what I'll call personal spending, which is spending money on oneself, and this grossly captured people's monthly estimates devoted to bills and expenses and gifts for themselves. Similarly, we created an index of pro-social spending, or how much money people spent in an average month on others. And here we collapsed money donated to charity along with gifts for other people. Then we simply asked, how do these 2 spending indices relate to well-being? What we found was that how much money people spent in an average month on themselves was unrelated to their happiness reports, but how much money people spent on others did indeed predict their well-being, such that the more they spent on others, the happier they reported feeling. Now, thinking back to what I mentioned just a few moments ago about the bidirectional relationship between generosity and happiness, I think this raises at least 2 interesting explanations. One is that spending money generously or helping others might make us happy, but the other is that happier people might be more likely to do this in the first place. So to figure out what was really driving what, we conducted a series of experiments trying to figure out whether spending money generously made people happier. To this end, I went out on the morning hours on campus and recruited a sample of students for a study on everyday spending habits. If they agreed, they were given either $5 or $20 to spend that day, and half of the students were randomly assigned to spend this money on a personal expense, buying a gift for themselves, a bill or expense, and the other half were randomly assigned to spend the money on a pro-social expense, so a gift for someone else or a donation to charity. Everybody was asked to spend the money by 5 p.m. so that we could call them with a series of questions, with our primary question of interest being how happy they were feeling. What we found was that people randomly assigned to spend money on others were significantly happier at the end of the day than people who were randomly assigned to spend the money on themselves. But these findings were collected in North America, and we were curious about whether these emotional benefits of generous spending might be detectable in other places around the world, particularly where people might have less disposable income and perhaps might feel better spending some of their limited financial resources on themselves. So to address this question, I worked with an international team of collaborators and collected data from a relatively rich and a relatively poor nation, Canada and South Africa. Here we recruited a large sample of students to participate in a study. They were paid a small amount for showing up, but after completing a series of questionnaires, we told them, hey, you've earned an extra couple dollars that you can use to buy a goodie bag filled with candy or juice. It's up to you. They got to pick whatever they wanted in their goodie bag. They saw it packaged up right in front of them. And then half of the participants were told that this goodie bag was for them to take home at the end of the experiment. The other half were told that this goodie bag would be donated to a sick kid at their local children's hospital. Afterward, everybody reported how they felt. What we found was that, consistent with our earlier evidence, people who bought a goodie bag for charity were happier than those who bought a goodie bag for themselves. And importantly, this was true not just in Canada, where people had extra disposable income, but also in South Africa, where a sizable proportion of our sample reported having trouble securing money and food for their family over the past 12 months. Looking beyond these two nations, my collaborators and I examined data from the Gallup Poll with over 230,000 responses from 100 people in 136 countries. What we found was that donating money to charity in the past month was associated with happiness in 88% of countries, even while controlling for a number of extra covariates that might explain this relationship. In fact, these findings can be seen in this world map here, where countries shown in green indicate a positive relationship between generous spending and happiness, and countries shown in red indicate a negative relationship. The darker the color, the stronger the relationship, and as you can see, the world is primarily green, suggesting a pervasive link between generous spending and happiness around the globe. So these findings suggest that generous spending might lead to higher levels of happiness in rich and poor nations, which got me very interested in how universal this finding might be, and in particular, at what age we as humans might start to feel good about giving to others. So I started reading a little bit of the developmental psychology literature to see if this question had been tested. To my surprise, it hadn't, but a growing body of research was documenting that kids were engaging in generous behavior very early in life, and in fact, even do so when it's costly. You can imagine these little toddlers getting up from an enjoyable game and waddling across the room to go help a stranger who's in need. And so this led me to wonder why that might be. And one possibility, amongst many others, is that young kids, just like the adults we've been talking about, might also feel good when they help others. And so to address this question, I worked with some collaborators at UBC again, Elizabeth Dunn and Kylie Hamlin, to examine whether kids just under the age of 2 might also feel good when they help others. So in this particular study, we recruited kids who were 22 months old. They came into the lab with a parent and participated in a 5-phase experiment. So they were first introduced to a puppet like Monkey here. They were allowed to pet, touch, and interact with him, and they were told that Monkey really liked eating edible treats like goldfish crackers and Teddy Grahams. Then each child was given their own little bowl with 8 edible treats, and then over the next few minutes in random order was asked to watch or engage in 3 important behaviors. The first was to watch as the experimenter gave a treat to Monkey. The second was to give one of the experimenter's treats to Monkey. And the third was to give one of their own treats to Monkey. And every time Monkey was given a treat, he would shove his face in the bowl and appear to eat the treat, going, mmm, and the treat would disappear. Now, obviously, you as adults know that a stuffed animal can't eat a treat, but we convinced the kids that he could by using his nose to push a treat through the false bottom corner in the bowl. So when Monkey lifted his head, the treat was gone. And it seems that we pretty much convinced the kids of this, so that was great. Now, we wanted to know not just whether kids would engage in these behaviors, but how it made them feel. And because kids are notoriously bad at self-reporting their own emotion repeatedly over the span of several minutes, instead of asking them to report how they were feeling, we videotaped them and later coded their facial expressions for happiness. What we found was that kids smiled significantly more when they gave treats away to Monkey than when they received treats themselves, but their smiles were actually significantly larger when they gave their own treat away than when they gave an identical one that did not belong to them, suggesting that not only do kids find generosity rewarding, but that it might be especially so when it involves some sense of self-sacrifice. But are people able to intuit or predict these emotional rewards of generous behavior, and in particular spending? Well, when we asked a sample of over 100 Canadian students what they thought would make them happier, spending money on themselves or others, the significant majority thought they'd be happier spending money on themselves, suggesting that they might not have the best insight into the emotional rewards of these generous or self-focused spending activities. More broadly, these findings align with the human inability to perfectly predict how we'll respond to emotional events. That isn't to say that humans are completely clueless. We know that if we go on a date with a new and exciting person, that will probably make us happy, and if we lose a dear or valued job, we'll be pretty sad. But humans are notoriously bad at predicting the extent and the magnitude of these emotions. So the Patriots fan pictured here will probably think that he'll be elated if his team wins the upcoming Super Bowl and depressed for months if the team loses, when in reality he probably will be happy if they win and sad if they lose, but probably not feel the extreme emotion he predicts or for nearly as long. So in summary, what I'd like to leave you with today is that science's secrets to greater happiness are not nearly as mysterious, elusive, or expensive as you might have thought. In fact, I think the secrets to happiness are all around. They're in the new, old, or soon-to-be friend in the seat beside you. They're in the beautiful outdoors here at SFU just waiting to be explored, in the lesson eagerly awaiting your undivided attention, and in the generosity that we can give to our neighbors. And so while we might not perfectly predict this in advance, science suggests that if we engage some of our time, energy, and money into any of these behaviors, we'll probably be better or happier off. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I would like to invite Nicole up for her first question, and then we'll begin to open it up to the audience. Thank you.
I'd stand here. It feels awkward because you're behind me now. I'll just kind of face you.
Sure.
So I was just kind of wondering, I noticed that in the top 10 list, Canada is pretty high up there, and I was wondering if you had any thoughts about why we as a nation might be like pretty up high in the list of.
Oh, why we are so high, or why we're not number one?
No, not that, but because I know some of the other countries, they're pretty awesome as well. Yeah, just thoughts on why do you think we're in the top 10?
I think there are many things that go into influencing who's in that, in that top 10 list. A lot of them have to do with the wealth of the nation. Like I was saying, people living in wealthier countries tend to be happier, but also a lot has to do with trust of government and trust in one's neighbors. That's also one of the top predictors of well-being, and I think Canada tends to be quite high with that. There are many war-torn nations in places where people don't trust their government or their police, and that seems to be a huge hit on happiness. And so there are many, many things and many differences that explain that vary across countries, but those are some of the top predictors of well-being where Canada tends to fare quite well, but not perfectly so.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was also wondering if you had any sort of ideas yourself about, because there is a couple nations that kind of had a negative attitude towards helping others. If you had any thoughts on why that might be.
Yeah, well, to clear, so are you talking about the world map I showed? There were a few in red. Yeah, no, that's a great observation. So there are a few nations on that graph that show either a hint of red or one or two that are actually strongly red. Those that are just a hint of red are actually not statistically significant in that there is a negative relationship between generous spending and happiness, but it's not significantly so. But there are actually two that are negative in counter to our hypothesis. And to be honest, I've showed those data to a bunch of people from different disciplines to try to understand, like political science, economics, sociology, to try to understand why that might be. And in short, we've come up with, and again, this isn't an experiment, so there are lots of different explanations, so take it with a grain of salt, but at this point, nobody's been able to really offer a convincing explanation for why those countries. They are places that are particularly war-torn, and so some of them, that might have something to do with it, but the larger explanation we've kind of come up with, my collaborators and I, is that even things that we think might be universal sometimes have instances where they just aren't always so, and this might be one of those situations where across the board, most of the time, it seems that generosity leads to happiness, but it's not a perfect predictor, certainly. Okay. Yeah. Sorry if that's an unsatisfying answer. There's no short answer is there's no answer, but we've thought about it.
And on your kind of last note there, why do you think that people sometimes don't think that being generous to others is going to make them happy? Like that pie chart there. Yeah,
that's a really intriguing one. So as I tried to hit on with that, I guess second or third last slide, is just that humans are not so great at predicting what's going to make them happy generally, but money seems to be a particularly dicey situation for that in that regard. there's a lot of evidence I didn't cover in this short talk suggesting that simple reminders of money tend to make people more self-focused or more independent. So for better or for worse, when people are simply reminded of the concept of money, they ask for less help from others but provide less help to others. And this kind of aligns with some recent evidence suggesting that in unequal places, people from low SES tend to offer more help to other people than high SES people, and even when you experimentally manipulate this. So all of this to say that money tends to make people focus on themselves. And so if you combine the fact that reminding people of money before you ask them about how they want to spend it and what will make them happy is probably not great, with the fact that people don't really know what makes them happy more broadly, I think it's just a volatile situation where people are very likely to make accurate predictions.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Now an opportunity to open it up to questions from the audience. If anyone has a question, just please speak quite clearly into the mic. Or I can relay the question for you. Okay, over here.
So, in terms of magnitudes, if you make someone someone from a very unhappy country on average, and then you give them all this advice to improve their happiness level, but they're still in this very unhappy country because of other country issues, how much happier they can be. So these individual ones as opposed to the country ones, how are the magnitudes different? And are all those studies measured in terms of the same scale that you showed?
No. No. So, yeah, many thoughts swirling in my head. So first and foremost, happiness I use loosely here as a term because the literature's got many components to this larger concept. So generally speaking, people who study happiness think more about subjective well-being, which is thought to include, at least argued to include, the presence of positive affect, so momentary mood, the absence of current negative affect, and cognitive life satisfaction, so thinking about your life as a whole. And those three pieces often kind of correlate together, but not perfectly so. And it gets extra sticky when you start to think about certain things like income predicting parts of that better than others. For instance, income is a lot more closely aligned with people's life satisfaction, their cognitive appraisals of their life, but moment-to-moment happiness doesn't correlate nearly as well with income as cognitive life satisfaction does. So that makes it a little bit more complicated to answer your question because all the evidence is collected using different scales. So it's hard to compare magnitude across studies. But I think the larger sentiment of your question is, can you give this advice to people living in difficult situations, and will it effectively improve their mood? Giving the advice doesn't mean people are going to follow it. That's obviously one important caveat. But I think certain things like relationships are robust predictors in the Gallup Poll around the world, even in really dicey places like war-torn countries, places where you have people you can count, people who report that they have someone they can count on in times of need. That is still an important predictor of well-being. I might be a little bit more careful and cautious about encouraging exercise in difficult life situations. I mean, it probably still correlates with well-being, but I don't know if that's at the top of people's priority list if they're feeling in danger. So generally speaking, a lot of this evidence comes from North America, so should be extrapolated with caution. But I don't know whether that would be a perfect fix for people in a really tough place in their life.
Thank you. Over here, question, Dr. Young.
So when we think about people who are unhappy, we think about people like comedians, people who are poets, maybe playwrights. Are there any benefits to being unhappy?
Yes. Yeah. So I don't think unhappiness is necessarily it's first of all, it's small bouts. Emotions are informative for many reasons, right? So anger is often an outcome of unfair treatment. Happiness is usually a signal of good things happening in people's environment. And so feeling guilt or shame or disgust, all of these are informative emotions. And so unhappiness is often an important signal that something is maybe not wise or going on, something favorable is missing or not great. And so I think unhappiness can be a useful cue for people to perhaps look around and see why that might be. But people are actually, so happiness does promote a bunch of good behaviors. There's a large review paper by Sonia Lubomirsky, Lara Aknin, and Ed Diener that basically argues happiness often follows from good things happening, but it also predicts a whole bunch of wonderful things too. That being said, there are some experimentally demonstrated unfortunate outcomes. For instance, when people are in a good mood, they might be more likely to help other people, but they don't really critically evaluate information. And so people are just, the general logic there is that people become yay-sayers. They don't really think critically. They don't challenge injustice as much, if you will. And so, but people are just more likely to follow the rules. And so there are certainly some downsides. Yeah. Creativity, though, is... Yeah. But the examples you gave suggest that sometimes negative mood can be quite creative and generative. The evidence actually suggests the opposite. So usually people in a good mood tend to be more creative. But there are certainly exceptions to that rule. Yeah.
I have a question, and it's from an observation. It's I suppose folk wisdom. Is there any truth behind the assertion that sometimes those people who are least well off, least well advantaged, are more generous, tend to be more generous for others in need than, say, those who are not?
Yes. So I alluded to that. Didn't dive into it deeply. So there's some new research by Paul Piff and colleagues that came out of Berkeley recently, well, in 2010, that demonstrates that people who are of low SES tend to give more, particularly proportionally of their income or their earnings to charity or to help others, more than people who are high SES. That was the case in correlational data, but they also came up with some pretty crafty experimental designs where they put people in the mindset of either being low SES or high SES and then measured their donations afterward. And they found that people randomly assigned to this lower SES type mindset or comparison group gave more money afterward. Since then, some new research suggests that these results are most likely in highly unequal places, in California, for instance, where the studies was conducted, it's a highly unequal. The Gini coefficient there is quite high. But in other states where the differences between the rich and the poor are not nearly as extreme, those differences tend to minimize.
I'm wondering about the combining the findings about relationships and the findings about the grateful study and the complaining study. I wonder, in sometimes we don't go home and complain in part as some way of getting support from and engaging with our relationship. I don't usually go home and go to my office by myself and complain at my desk. I complain to my family or my partner or my children, and I'm wondering if that isn't, we're doing half the job. We're trying to create and get support and build the relationship, but doing it in the wrong way. So might there be some kind of push and pull at the same time of generating relationships by getting support and having people say it's okay, don't worry about it, you're a good guy,
That certainly makes sense. So in the gratitude journaling study, all of those were done kind of asocially, if you will. They were just written down, and so they minimized or actually removed the possibility of finding social support while complaining because you were just writing it to yourself, right? And as the anecdotal evidence I gave suggests, and as you just note, people don't go home and just brood at their computers necessarily. Some people do on paper or in journals, but most of the time when we complain, it's towards other people. It's to other people in hopes of getting social support. So I think that might be in a certain way an unfair comparison of this strategy, to the extent that we're complaining or discussing our hassles with other people and receiving social support. That might actually not be so bad for our well-being, but I don't think it's what that gratitude journal study suggests, or the way I interpret it, is that outing this negative information in and of itself isn't beneficial for our well-being, but the social relationships aspect might be. That opportunity to build there, I think. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Yes.
Excellent, yes.
You mentioned in the generosity aspect of happiness that there's like a level of self-sacrifice. Just from my own experiences, there's things that I like to do either in volunteer work or in that kind of sense that I really enjoy, and then there's some that I can't really think of any, but stuff that I wouldn't be as optimistic to do. Like I've had to sort cans in a food bank, and that was help to others, but I didn't feel like that happiness where You know, if I'm volunteering and I'm working with youth, like that for me is something more rewarding in that regard. Is there like different kinds of qualities that come up?
Certainly, yeah. So I've done a little bit of work in this regard, but there's a large literature basically suggesting or trying to help us understand when kind acts might be particularly rewarding. Some of our evidence suggests that, like you noted, that costly behaviors might be more rewarding, at least in some circumstances. But I think what you're touching on, at least through the examples there, opportunities that allow a sense of social connection are often those that are most rewarding, in part because they allow this chance to build relationships. So, you know, volunteering with youth is much more relationship building than sitting in a room, you know, I don't know, I'm trying, like, licking envelopes. You know, like you might be doing that for a charitable cause, but it's not the same way to build connections. Other things that seem to matter, at least in line with past research, is engaging in these behaviors because you've chosen to do it and you're not forced to do it. If someone makes you do charitable work, it's actually not as effective, for at least for you experiencing the emotional rewards of giving, than you opting to do it. And third is the sense of having a positive impact. So opportunities that lend themselves to you, for you to see how you're having an impact, tend to be more rewarding than those that are further removed.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I work in donor relations at the university, and I was just curious if there's any, you know, happiness factor changes when people are acknowledged for giving charitably versus no acknowledgement.
Yes, generally speaking, people tend to report higher levels of happiness when they're acknowledged for it. And it tends to boost donations too. The thing you just want to be careful is not to make that the reason for donations, because as soon as people start to do it for extrinsic reasons, they don't feel the same emotional rewards as they might when they do it for those intrinsic warm glow reasons.
Yes.
What role does poetry play
What role does poetry play?
in happiness?
I don't know of any work directly testing that. It would seem that happiness might promote poetry in terms of creativity and generativity. To the extent that you feel like it's a way to give back to others, it might make you feel good. But I don't know anything specifically about generating poetry predicting happiness.
Yeah, I was asking because many times people often express sadness through poetry. Mm-hmm. So I was just saying the other way around.
Yeah.
You know, I write poetry.
Mm-hmm. It might be cathartic. There is some evidence showing that talking about or writing about difficult life events does lead to people are faster and better able to kind of come to terms with negative events the more they write about it. So if poetry is a means of doing that might be facilitating the same outcome.
A follow-up.
Yeah, would that kind of tie into the whole mind wandering to like being in the present? So if you're writing about something, expressing it, you're kind of feeling with what's going on in the present moment. Would that kind of tie in?
Interesting. So the writing, the James Pennebaker work stuff on writing about overcoming trauma and dealing with difficulty, it might have something to do with that, but actually it seems like where the meat of that manipulation is, like what seems to really be doing the trick, isn't just a one-off writing exercise, it's about coming to terms with the experience through writing. So it's about, often what happens is people write about the same thing over multiple periods, and you can actually see a difference in the words that they use. They start to make more meaning while writing over time. So a one-off writing exercise may reflect how people feel in the moment. It's not to say that a one-off wouldn't, but generally what I know from that literature is that it's often more the repeated writing where people start to make events make sense.
Who's the author for that again?
James Pennebaker. You're welcome.
I have a follow-up question.
Sure.
Again.
Sure.
Sorry.
That's okay.
What I would like to know is governments and even local cities are increasingly investigating well-being indices instead of sort of typical measures of economic job creation and so on, to guide them in designing better places and incorporating a sense of social belonging. So what does the science of happiness have to say about this movement towards well-being indices?
Yeah.
Vancouver Foundation here locally is one of the pioneers in Canada, for example, but I don't think they've talked to a psychologist with an expertise like yours.
Well, one of my collaborators actually on that international project is John Helliwell. He's an economist at UBC who consults with the Canadian government, and he's works with Gallup very regularly and has pushed with Diener to be has pushed quite forcefully to get these indices in these big measures, in these big scales, excuse me, for that very reason. I mean, they as economists are saying that, you know, it's not that money is a bad measure, but it's not a perfect predictor of the human condition. And if that's our ultimate goal, we can measure it more precisely now. GDP isn't going to give you the same input. And so I think, I mean, I don't consult with the Gallup World Poll directly, but it's nice to know that there are people who do. Like the Stats Can is measuring this stuff now. There are a lot of great efforts to try to measure human well-being directly instead of indirectly now. And there is quite a close collaborative, to my understanding, like with Gallup and the Canadian government, there is a lot of discussion about using the evidence and trying to understand what we've learned.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Any advice to post-secondary institutions to grow more happiness within?
To find ways to kind of foster these types of predictors. I mean, this wasn't an exhaustive list, but there are certainly ways to foster connection in the classroom, to foster connection to one's community, to one's environment. To engage in exercise is actually a very easy thing for them to do, and to let students kind of, I think, kind of own their generosity. There are a lot of school-based philanthropy programs that are starting to pick up steam, and I think that's wonderful. But I think there should be more. People are starting to pay close attention to the assessment of those programs, and because I think while it's a very noble goal, we want to make sure that students are, you know, it's research informed and that it is having the impact we hope it will.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Time for one last question.
Yes. Oh, two of them.
Okay. We have two last
How
questions.
does
Very quickly, go
does
ahead.
happiness correlates with suicide rates?
Oh, probably quite low. I don't know because, I mean, usually suicide is considered like the ultimate marker of unhappiness. And so my suspicion, I couldn't cite a data set off the top of my head, but my suspicion is that people who are low in life satisfaction are more likely to commit suicide.
Yeah, but in terms of countries.
Oh, sorry?
In terms of countries.
Oh, suicide rates.
Because it could be the case that countries with high levels of happiness, average levels of happiness are also.
Yes. Yeah. That's so. I don't know of any data offhand. My only caution, and there, I suspect Gallup have the data, or you could combine multiple sources to look at that question. My only caution would be to also pay special attention to other factors as well. Like there are certain countries where the taboo or the support for assisted suicide vary greatly, and alternative explanations. But offhand, I do not know. Sorry.
My question is about the role of fear on happiness.
Yeah.
And the second question is, how does the friendship between grandparents and grandchildren contribute to happiness, or is it one of the?
So can you tell me more about the fear? Can you give me a little bit more?
I come from Africa where people talk to each other without knowing their names and so on, because partly we fear God, G-O-D, but people don't fear people. Here I find people fear people. For example, I came to Canada in 1994, and I used to go to all these festivals, and nobody would talk to me. Now I volunteer, and everybody talks with me. It's just because I wear a necklace. So is necklace a fear buster?
Yeah. I don't know of any studies that capture that whole idea, but there is some recent work that was published a couple years ago from 2 independent labs that came out at the same time, basically showing that talking with strangers leads to happiness benefits, but people don't appreciate it at all. Or people don't anticipate it at all. So the idea of being told to go sit on a bus and talk to the person next to you is something that terrifies many people, or they just would never think of doing. But the reality is when people are asked to do that, through the purposes of a study, they feel much better afterward than sitting in their own little bubble the whole commute. So there certainly are advantages to just connecting with people in our environment, but again, aligned with one of the last points I made, people don't necessarily intuit that and therefore kind of miss these opportunities to connect and feel better for it.
The second question, do you have anything?
So generally speaking, connection of all senses seems to be quite good for well-being. I don't know of any work specifically comparing grandparents and kids, but I have no reason to suspect that might be any different. Meanwhile, my son is at home with my mother right now, and I can tell you that they both were really happy when I left. So anecdotal data suggests that it looks quite good, but I don't know of any study that directly looks at just that. There is intergenerational mingling that has been shown to be good for both parties, but that is not necessarily grandparents and grandkids.